Robot Giraffe.
It was Tim Dillon of The Tim Dillon Show. When you think of comedians, you might often think of struggling ones living in their van, struggling to make a penny at shows. Maybe you envision a sort of barbaric rudeness and adversity in everything they say. Well, you might often be right, but in some cases, some comedians break the mold and edge on that line between all-out absurdity and a calm sense of professionalism. One of these examples is Tim Dillon. Tim Dillon, the backstory. Tim Dillon is a comedian, podcaster, and producer who has been making it big for the past decade. He was born in 1985 in Island Park, New York, of Irish descent. Keep in mind the whole Irish thing because he really likes to make jokes about it. Like most comedians, Tim didn't get his start in comedy right away. In fact, he actually tried his hand at acting, which didn't go so well. You can't really blame him, though, as he was only 9 years old and his role was for Sesame Street. He did it twice and pretty much called it quits. How bad do you need to be to mess up Sesame Street? Well, it goes to show that people find their niche in very unlikely situations. His childhood may not have been as bright as the kids on Sesame Street. However, as his parents got divorced when he was young and he was living with his mother, to make matters worse, his mother suffered from a case of schizophrenia. How exactly that might have affected him, though, well, other than suffering from a case of being a comedian, he seems pretty unaffected by it. But you never know. What Tim did suffer from, however, is substance abuse. Even though he has been sober for years, Tim stated that he started abusing drugs and alcohol when he was only 13 years old and became a full-blown cocaine addict at the ripe age of 18. As a child, he grew up Christian and even discussed it on an episode of his podcast with Ari Shafir, joking that being a Christian makes him a perfected Jew. On that same episode, he described the kinship that he feels toward Irish people. Still, it wasn't until much later that he actually did do stand-up comedy. First, he graduated from Nassau Community College. He worked a bunch of normal people jobs and bad luck seemed to just follow him everywhere. He worked in the printer sales business, tourism, and even worked as a mortgage broker when the subprime mortgage crisis was going on. On an episode of the Joe Rogan Experience, Tim Dillon opened up about his time on a cruise ship and continued to joke about his experiences, even though made his way through the world of comedy in 2010. It wasn't until 2016 that his career really took off. This is credited to an appearance at the Just for Laughs Comedy Festival in Montreal, Canada, just a year later, in 2017. Rolling Stone magazine listed Tim as one of the 10 comedians you need to know. Ever since then, Tim Dillon's career has been getting bigger and bigger and his audience has been growing. He has been making several live shows ever since, and some even outside of the US, in areas such as Australia. Tim's podcasting endeavors. Around the time of his stand-up comedy boom, Tim started his own podcast originally called Tim Dillon Is Going to Hell. He hosted the podcast with Ray Kump. The podcast was mainly a product of Tim's style of comedy, based around stories from his personal life and experiences, and making fun of Americans and their culture and politics. Later, Tim partnered up with Ben Avery on the podcast. The Tim Dillon podcast was now one of the biggest hits, but there was clearly tension between Tim and Ben. In several instances, Tim called out Ben in a joking manner, but it still seemed serious enough. After Ben's departure, Tim still had good things to say and didn't try to paint him in any bad light. He even said that he offered him a lot of money, but apparently Ben was simply unhappy and wanted to move on to other things. It seemed as if the fighting bit between Tim and Dillon was quite real. The Tim Dillon Show YouTube channel currently has 492,000 subscribers, with several episodes garnering views way above this. The show currently has 324 episodes, and even though it started out as a simple podcast, it grew so much that Tim has begun interviewing big names, not just in the comedy world, but in general. Some of his guests include Bill Burr, Joe Rogan, Louis C.K., and even Jordan Peterson. What's interesting about Tim's style of interviewing when he's with a big name such as Jordan Peterson is his surprising ability to listen. Unlike several interviewers and late-night talk show hosts, Tim can leave a guest talking for minutes on end without interruption and dive deep into heavy subjects. Of course, he will crack the occasional joke once in a while, but overall, he lets his guests talk. As an example, he got pretty deep with Jordan Peterson about his life and his reception, and even though he cracked a quick joke comparing the backlash Peterson got to Osama bin Laden, he kept the interview serious enough. Perhaps this is one of the hooks Tim's audience likes. The fact that even though he can be very extreme at times, he knows when to actually quiet down and talk about something serious like the Israel-Palestine conflict or other political matters. With over 40,000 subscribers of the podcast on Patreon, Tim is scoring north of $2 million a year from that alone. The Tim Dillon Netflix special and his comedic style. After gaining enough fame through live shows and his podcast, Tim Dillon released his own Netflix comedy special, Tim Dillon, A Real Hero, in 2022. The special has been praised with a 6.3 rating on IMDb, which is not bad for a first-time full comedy special. The special represents Tim's style of comedy, which is mostly talking about things from experience and then going on a tangent. For example, he talks about fast food for a bit after sharing a joke about Pizza Hut from his childhood. You can classify Dillon's style as a comedy of experience. Other topics he took on in the special are things like adults in Disney, Texas, overweight people, the idea of a hero, and more. A popular topic of his is conspiracy theories, which he brought up as part of the special and even tackled on the Joe Rogan Experience before. On Rogan's podcast, he showed just how educated he was on American history and the lengths of what he had read. He shared this conspiracy theory of the CIA, Jimi Hendrix, and Bob Dylan. What might be surprising, though, is Tim's total indifference toward politics. He comes off a bit nihilistic with the way he handles his political opinions, which seem to neither go that much left nor right. In one of his podcast episodes, he outright stated, "One viewpoint that I have is that I don't care, I'm unaffected, and I don't know how to fix it." This might come off surprising, as most comedians' bread and butter is politics, and it seems like more and more comedians are either getting praised or canceled for their political views day by day. However, because most comedians don't really have that filter of what is inappropriate and what is alright to joke about, it goes over many people's heads. For example, Tim joked about Jewish people several times, and coming from any other celebrity, this would be interpreted as anti-Semitic and raised a ton of heads on Twitter. But because it's a comedian known for adversity, it often goes unbothered when it comes to the level of offense and abrasiveness in his comedy. However, while it's still there, it's far less than more shock jock comedians or podcast hosts whose sole intent is going after others and making fun of them. Dillon, while not really being Uncle Rogers, does give off a sense of being a bit tamer. His very dry delivery may contribute to this, but he's not exempt from going after the occasional target, like Ellen DeGeneres. At this point, it's expected of most comedians, as offense has become so tightly interwoven with the job that simply cracking jokes doesn't do it for audiences anymore. Tim Dillon's big bucks. Remember how I mentioned the poor comedian at the start? Well, that's definitely not Tim Dillon. Tim's net worth is anywhere between $4 million to $10 million, according to different sources. Not all of his money comes from Patreon, podcasting, and stand-up though, as he also invests in real estate. He owns 3 houses, one in Austin, an estate worth over $2 million in the Hamptons, and apparently a $4.6 million Hollywood Hills house. So, it goes to show that comedians can be just as rich, if not more than actors.